teacher. Thanks for accepting me to be interviewed. The current interview is about difference in the use of the same language. It will not take more than 5 or 10 minutes, okay? So we can start?
Yes, we can start. First, my name, right?
Yeah, please, what is your name?
My name is Pedro Fiar, and I work at Royal English Language House Institute.
Thank you so much. The first question is about how can you differentiate language from dialect?
A language is what our community speaks in terms of the words and the terms and the structures that are common for all those people who speak the same language. However, a dialect is more like the variant, the lexicosemantic variants that people use when they speak in their own reality, and it will depend on their social status and their educational level, and also it has a great dependence on where they come from. So people from different regions of the world speak the same language in different ways. They use different terms and they use different vocabulary and sometimes also different structures in syntax. So that's the main difference I see between language and dialects.
Okay, thank you. We can continue with the second question. How can you define morphology?
Morphology is a science that studies all the elements that make up the word, speaking of the morphemes, prefixes and suffixes, to form new words from a root, and words that of course will change the meaning of what you intend to say.
All right, it's very interesting, huh? Okay, I have another question also. How can you define syntax?
Syntax is a term that defines the way in which we structure our statements, meaning the position of subject, verb, predicate, and no matter whether active or passive, but it's about all the elements that make up the sentence. We're talking about subject, we're talking about all the objects in the sentence, direct, indirect objects. And speaking of linguistics, we can speak of actants. So that is all the elements that make up the sentence.
Okay. I have another question. What is the most common way in which dialects of a language vary? Pronunciation, spelling, or sentence information? Sorry, for sentence formation.
I would say pronunciation, because when we speak of dialects, we're talking about spoken language more than written language. People usually speak depending on where they come from, but people usually write more formally because written texts are all about being formal. However, pronunciation is going to be very important in dialects. And also you mentioned another thing. It was sentence formation, because as I said, depending on the educational level of people will be able to structure sentences more formally or informally, and that is also something that happens when we deal with dialects.
Okay. Can you provide an example of dialect variation based on the option you just choose?
Yes, for example, if we speak of English, we can find many examples based on pronunciation, like the differences between American English and British English, for example. To name the verb can, whereas in English, in American English, you pronounce it with a smiling A, can. British people tend to make it more like a darker vowel, so they would say something like con. So that's the difference in pronunciation, and it's the same word with the same meaning, only that pronounced differently because they come from different places.
Okay, what is the most common reason for dialects to vary? Geographical locations, economic status, or educational status?
I would say the first one and the third one. In the first place, where you come from, what country you come from, will have an impact on what dialect you speak. And definitely your educational level will also have an impact on the dialect that you use. Because even though you come from one place or another, if you are more educated, you will use a more, probably, let's say, regular dialect than that of your own hometown, for example. So definitely the first one and the third one.
Okay. Can you provide an example of dialect variation based on the option you just choose?
Yes, definitely. For example, speaking of Spanish, in Ecuador, people call llave to the water source, to the water fountain, to the water faucet. However, in Cuba, they call it pila. So there are two different terms that refer to the same object with the same meaning, but there are two different words to name the same thing. So that's one example.
Taking into account English language, can you tell an existing difference in regard to pronunciation, spelling, and sentence formation between British and American English?
Well, as I mentioned before, in pronunciation, I made an example with can and con, or I don't know because I'm not a specialist in British English, but I know there are many examples with pronunciation, like they make vowels darker than American English. In terms of spelling, the ending ER, for example, in words like center, whereas American people would spell it ER, British people would do RE, and that's one difference. Makes no problem with meaning, but it does have a difference in spelling. And then in sentence formation, well, I have to think a little bit more, but I'm pretty sure that in choosing, for example, the verb have, American people would say something like, for example, I have 2 pets at home, whereas British people would say, I have got 2 pets at home. So that difference, it's because of the dialect that they're speaking.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, okay. Taking into, is there any other dialect variation that you can tell how it happens?
I could mention something that happens within the same country, and it has to do with also with the roots of where people come from. It is very evident in countries like Ecuador that there is a marked difference between the way people from the coast region speak and the way people from the Andean region speak. Definitely, it looks like the Andean people are more of careful when they pronounce words and in the structures that they use. And I think that something that has to do with that is the weather. And the weather, if considered a phenomenon that affects people's lives, it also affects language, because when you are colder, because you live in the mountains, you tend to be more strict with language use. However, if you are from the coast, you just don't pay much attention to details, and that happens not only in everyday life, but also it's present in the way people speak their language.
I forgot one question, but when you talk about the coast and Sierra, taking into account Spanish language, can you tell exists difference in regard to pronunciation, spelling, and sentence formation between coast and Sierra region speakers?
I just said, I strongly think that depending on where you come from, depending on the activity that you do every single day, the school you attend to, there is a difference, a marked difference between the mountain region of the country and the coast region of this country, yes.
Okay, then, thank you, teacher. It's a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you too for this interview.